Today we are joined by Daniel Miller, president of the Texas Nationalist Movement and outspoken advocate for Texas independence since 1996. He has been featured on every major news network and been interviewed by every major newspaper in Texas and around the world. A featured guest on Fox News, CNN, CNBC, BBC News, and many other news outlets, Miller has been a vocal proponent of a fundamental re-examination of the relationship between all states in the federal union. He's also the author of several books about which we will be discussing today. Mr. Miller, we thank you for joining us today on the Right on Point podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Before we begin our discussion today, why don't you share for our listeners a little bit more about your background?
Wow, I am a native-born Texan. I have been here. Actually, our family's been here for I'm the sixth generation Texan. My first ancestor here actually fought at the battle that delivered Texas independence. So, small town guy. Been involved in political activism probably since I was a kid, and throughout that process, the thought of this evolved to realize that really the true answer to solve so many of the problems here was Texas independence. But beyond that, I'm a father, 6 children, small business owner. So I have to go out here, unlike some of our folks in the progressive left. I actually have to go out here and live and work in the real world rather than just engage in political activism. But that's, if you want to understand at the very core, I am a Texan. I am a husband. I'm a father, and I'm a Christian. And those things truly inform so much of my passion for an independent Texas.
So now, for our listeners who may not know, what is Texit and what is your book Texit talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the news cycle, what leaks from overseas, the news cycle is dominated by the term Brexit, which is the term that was coined for Britain's exit from the European Union. However, that term actually originated back when during the Greek Eurozone crisis, where it looked like Greece was going to exit the Euro and perhaps the European Union. And so some economists threw it out there as a mashup word, Grexit. And then, of course, when the Eurosceptic movement moved into the referendum mode, it became Brexit. And then it wasn't too long that people started talking about Texas exiting from the Union as Texit. And I think, honestly, it works better for us. I mean, we literally have an X in our name, right? So it works out really good for us. But, yeah, I mean, it works so well, right? Yeah. But, it really has become the catch-all phrase for this feeling, and now beyond a feeling, a political movement to reassert Texas' status as an independent nation, to not go back to some long-gone days of the Republic of Texas, but to reclaim that original sovereignty that we have and that right of self-government. So, when you hear people talk about it, the media loves to use the Texas secession word, but frankly, nobody's even talking like that anymore. It's really all about the term Texit.
So I want to ask a little bit more about your book specifically. What made you write this book, and what has the response been among fellow Texans and maybe other conservatives across the country?
Yeah, it's interesting. My first book that I wrote, honestly, it was back in 2011. Honestly, I'm not an author, right? And if you were to talk to the publisher about how they had to horsewhip me into getting this book done, you'll understand why. My phrase is, I would rather be out achieving and securing independence than writing about it, right? So. But just like my first book, Line in the Sand, in 2011, it's about really just trying to encapsulate all of not just this idea, but practically how to accomplish it. I hesitate to call it a really big, frequently asked questions section. But what I wanted to do specifically with Texit was to to really change the conversation, to really give the people that are supporters of Texas independence a concise guide to how to articulately debate this issue, to give them the facts that they need to go out and have the conversation. And frankly, I'll tell you, after being engaged in this debate for 20 years, 1996 is when I got involved in earnest. One of the things that has become very evident is that the people here in Texas that are absolutely opposed to this are opposed to it at a visceral level, right? They really haven't thought this through. So they restrict their opposition to a very small basket of stock answers that have absolutely no rational depth whatsoever. And so what I wanted to make sure of is that, while I can go out and I can answer these questions and handle these objections and walk people through this step by step, I wanted to make sure that anyone who wanted to take a serious look at this, excuse me, whether they're for it, whether they're undecided, I wanted them to be able to have a book where they could look at this and say, look, I understand now that there is support for this. I understand why that support exists. I understand how it could happen and what it could look like on the other end of it, and have that rational conversation about it.
Did you find that, sorry, Olivia, that certain political temperaments are more inclined to supporting this? Like, are conservatives more likely to support the Texit, or liberals, or has it just been bipartisan, I guess?
Well, you have to understand, you look at the makeup of Texas and you understand where people ideologically fall. We have noticed, and it was very evident during the Brexit debates, oddly enough, in the run-up to the referendum, we noticed this trend across independence movements over the last 70 years that they have a tendency to transcend partisan politics, right? And a lot of it stems from this idea that, we can sit here and we may be on opposite sides of a certain policy issue, and we could argue it out. We could come to a solution between the two of us. But as long as there is a government and a capital that is not ours, no matter what we decide, we'll never have the final say. And I'll give you a great example of that, one that has been on the lips of many here in Texas, especially during this last legislative session. And that's on all the pro-life issues. The pro-life community here in Texas is coming to the realization that but for our attachment and subservience to Washington, D.C., life would be absolutely protected here in Texas. Texas has shown time and time again that it's a very strong pro-life state, but yet even in the debates on pro-life legislation in this last legislative session, the Supreme Court of the United States continued to come up in those discussions, in those debates, in those hearings as the stumbling block. For example, we could pass further restrictions on abortion in Texas except for Roe v. Wade or except for the federal courts. And so, but you see that play out in so many different issues. Almost half of the bills that were filed in this last legislative session directly referenced the federal government, a federal law, a federal agency, a federal regulation, or a federal court case. So, while we may have this illusion of self-government, the fact of the matter is that our laws are being dictated by 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. So while there is a tendency for Texas independence support to gravitate more toward the Republicans, we definitely poll higher among Republicans. 54% of Texas Republicans believe that Texas should become an independent nation. It also means that we have strong showings among independent voters, almost half of independent voters, and even a third of Democrats. This right of self-government, this idea that it's fallacy for us to every 2 years go in and decide, when we have these federal elections, the only decision that we're making is how long the chains are going to be and how heavy they're going to be. They're beginning to reject that notion and say there is something different for us that we can do.
Now, on the grassroots level in your political activism, when you talk to fellow Texans about this topic, are they enthusiastic about it overall, and what is their response? Are they usually in tune with the current debate about Texit, or are they hesitant?
No, it really depends. I mean, it's just like any political discussion. You get a mixed bag. But I will tell you that our volunteers go out and they connect with thousands of Texans. We connect with thousands upon thousands of Texans online. And what we see is a passion and an enthusiasm for Texas independence that you don't see for your normal basket of issues or political candidates. I'll tell you, and this is anecdotal, but our volunteers, one of the things they do is they go out and to connect with the community, they will go out and say host an outreach event in a city somewhere here in Texas. They'll go out, they'll have on their Texas Independent shirts, they'll be flying their flags. These are volunteers. And not a single event that we have goes by without someone, or typically more than one person, coming by and say, hey, I've been looking for this my entire life. There is a passion for this, because not just because these people are passionately Texan, but it's because, like so many people out there, they are passionately looking for a solution to what they see as a federal problem.
You hear the National Democratic Party at large saying that Texas could potentially be a swing state in 2020 or in a future presidential election cycle. You saw just last year in 2018, Beto O'Rourke being narrowly defeated by Senator Ted Cruz. I want to ask you, is part of the impetus behind this movement looking into the future and possible political and demographic changes in the state of Texas, and the potential that it might be lost to liberal changes or liberal democratic politicians?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure there's some underpinnings of that, but of course, our organization has been pushing for this for many years. I mean, our organization was founded in 2005. But beyond that, I have 20 years of history. And what I've seen is, over that 20 years, regardless of who sits in the White House, I've seen support for this grow. Now, that being said, these demographic changes are concerning to a certain extent about the politics, but the changes, the demographic changes that Texans really should be concerned about is the surge of people moving in from California and New York. Not the true economic and political and social refugees, because frankly, there's a whole lot of those. But those people that are moving here solely for the economic opportunity, that want to transform Texas into what they left. That's the biggest problem, regardless of the origin of the people who come here. But there is this idea that Texas may go Democrat in future elections. That doesn't drive Texas independence, but it does put a certain amount of urgency on it, and I'll explain why. Right now, it's illegal to take foreign campaign contributions. I mean, it's against the law here in Texas. You cannot take foreign money. However, every election cycle, and increasingly over the last few election cycles, we've seen election money, we've seen campaign money flow in from Washington, D.C., from California, from New York, from so many other states into Texas races to affect what the outcomes of these races are. And we all know that in politics, money is king, right? When you have George Soros and his organizations pumping $1 million into local judicial races, when you have Eric Holder in the last election, in the midterm, saying that he's going to pump $250,000 into Texas House races, now you've got a problem. So they understand that if they can change the face of Texas, then they're going to swing everything else. So, they want to do that, but I think they, to a certain extent, overplay their hand. In the book, I talk about how the specific demographic changes in relation to Hispanic immigrants, first and second generation Hispanic immigrants, actually show a more pro-Texas sentiment than some of the older white demographic that is pretty commonly cited by the media as a slur against us. So, our demographics more closely represent the demographics of our organization and Texas supporters more closely represent the demographics of Texas as a whole than either of the major political parties. So, the Democrats may want to come in here and try to shove their national policies down our throats, but Texans have shown a real they're quick to regurgitate these policies when they detect that they're coming from outside of Texas.
We thank you for joining us today on Right on Point. Before we continue with the second half of our show, we hope we've sparked your interest to visit our website, RightOnPointPodcast.com, where you can listen to previous episodes and interviews, contact us, and learn more about the program. As you scroll down our homepage, please consider making a contribution to our show. There are options to either make a one-time payment or to become a monthly donor through Patreon or PayPal. Both options are equally appreciated. Even a small one-time contribution goes a long way. Right on Point runs exclusively off of your generosity. Each payment helps our podcast remain on all your favorite platforms, wherever podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, and many more. And as we increasingly integrate more video into your Right on Point experience on YouTube, viewers will be able to see up close and personal our spectacular and unrivaled guest lineup, which includes some of the most influential names in politics today. Lastly, please subscribe to Right on Point on the platform you are currently listening to us so that you never miss an episode. We especially appreciate new subscribers on YouTube and iTunes. Thank you again for all of your support. We are absolutely committed to delivering our growing and devoted fan base the best experience possible. And now on to the second half of our show.
And we spoke about this a bit earlier, but what does the Brexit vote in 2016 and the continuing support of the Brexit Party in these recent parliament elections say about the strength of these independence movements on a longer range scale? How does your movement kind of model off of the Brexit movement, especially knowing its success there?
Well, that's a good question. Those European Parliament elections were kind of fascinating. I mean, it was like, not to sound too wonkish, but it was kind of like the Super Bowl over here at the Miller household, right?
Watching I'm
sure. But, look, I think it's important to understand, and I talk about this in the book, but I think it's important to understand that this growth of self-determination, independence movements is not a new phenomenon. Right. One of the stats that I cite in the book is that at the end of World War II, there were 54 recognized countries around the world, and at the end of the 20th century, there were 192. So as we enter into the 21st century, what we're seeing is these self-determination movements playing out primarily in these developed first world countries, if you want to call it that. And of course, in Europe, that's settling in on the Eurosceptic movement. These people that are looking at the European Union's encroachment on their sovereignty, and they're beginning to reject it, Britain being one of them. Democrats have stated time and time again that their goal is a United States of Europe, a federal Europe modeled on the United States of America. So if there's a rejection of this type of centralization over there, I mean, can you imagine what it looks like if you examine the Union as the founders and the framers intended it here? Right. That's a side note. But the point here is that as we look to if you want to look at the Texit movement as a whole, okay, not just our organization, the TNM, but Texit as a whole, what you're going to find is you're going to find similarities, not just with the Brexit Party or the UK Independence Party or the Scottish National Party or any of these independence movements in Catalonia. You're going to find similarities across the globe. One of the things that I do on a regular basis is actively communicate and coordinate with independence movements in places all around the world. Okay. Just this last week, we spoke with an independence movement that's starting or wanting to start in northern Italy, and they are extraordinarily Eurosceptic. We talked with some folks, oddly enough, in Venezuela that want to break away from Venezuela and the communism of the Maduro regime. We interface with these guys on a regular basis, and what we see is there is this desire for freedom and for self-government. But even with those similarities, I think it's important to acknowledge that every single one of these independence movements engages in its own unique path. So while the Brexit Party, we're encouraged by it, but we also understand that beyond, before the Brexit Party, there was the UK Independence Party, right? And we understand that progression, and we also understand that they are a product of their current political and electoral system. There is no true one-to-one comparison. But we can pick and choose and gain inspiration from their successes and learn from their challenges and their failures and understand that, we're not alone in this fight.
I agree 100% with that. We had Nigel Farage on our program back in February, and it's really fascinating and inspiring what's going on in Europe. We talked about Italy and what Steve Bannon is doing there for Eurosceptic parties, and it's sort of this common unifying force that unites everyone from what you're doing down in Texas to Europe to Latin America, so on and so forth. What do you think unites all of these movements? I mean, our Constitution is much different than what they have in France and Spain and United Kingdom and Latin America. Is it something, what's your view of our Constitution, our founding fathers? Is it something inherent in our constitutional system, or is there something else that's motivating all of these populist movements for national sovereignty?
Well, look, I think there is a deeper desire globally. But I don't think as I said earlier, I don't think it's a new phenomenon. We have seen this growth of all of these nations. I even cite in my book, I cite a book that was written by John Nesbitt back in the 90s called Global Paradox. And if you know John Nesbitt, he wrote Megatrends 2000. I like to refer to him as an economic futurist. But Nesbitt wrote this book, Global Paradox, back in the early 90s, and he said specifically that the world's trends point overwhelmingly toward political independence. And so, even kind of a pop futurist guy like him could see the writing on the wall, but in retrospect, it's not that hard. But as you're seeing this drive now, I think we're shifting into a new phase of it, where you had throughout the latter half of the 20th century, you had all of these people that had either been colonized, had been abused to a certain extent, by the government that they were a part of, and they said, "Look, we want to govern ourselves." I think that has really fueled what has taken place over the 21st century, and now it's also about, not just about good government, but it's about recognizing the right of self-government in these major world powers. Again, the globalists are going nuts, and at the heart, and that is at the heart of this. At the heart of the global movement is this fight between nationalism and globalism. Who is best to govern and manage our day-to-day affairs? Is it us, or is it some global elite? And people may bristle at couching it in that terms, but that really is the alternative. We either have to accept our nationhood, or we have to subsume ourselves to something that is not us, something global, some sort of global regime. But to your point, right? I mean, that's why I always love doing these interviews, because it's like, it's a short question, and then there's so much to unpack.
Right.
But
on this for hours.
Yeah, I know. But here's the point. You talked about our founders and our Constitution, and I think we have to look at some of the motivating factors here, specific to Texas and, frankly, some of the other states of the Union. If we want to look at the United States Constitution, and we look at what the framers wanted, and then we even go back further and look at the founders, what we see is a document that combines these newly formed independent sovereign states into a mutual defense pact, a trade agreement, a postal compact, a common foreign policy, and beyond that, not a whole lot, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. The federal government was meant to be small and to handle these very few specific things outlined in the document. And what we find now is we find ourselves in a consolidated union, and I throw the air quotes up, a consolidated union of once sovereign states that are all centrally managed and controlled by Washington, D.C., by 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats that have given us 180,000 pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations administered by 440 separate agencies. That's driven us almost $22 trillion into debt, that ensures that states have to toe the line, even when the federal government infringes upon the very fundamental rights guaranteed by the document that they purport to use to govern us. So if you want to talk about what's fostering and really fueling this support for Texas, it's simply this. It's that the people of Texas believe that they are best to govern themselves. And what we're seeing is a realization among the people of the other states that are rejecting the rule of 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats. They're saying, wait a minute, and I'll take an extreme example. Why should California be governed by people in Texas, right? But conversely, why should Texas be governed by people in California, right? Why can't we make our own laws? Why can't we set our own policy? And if you want to get down to the fundamental economic question of it, people here in Texas are wondering why in the world we're overpaying $150 billion every single solitary year into the federal system. I mean, that literally is like having Hurricane Harvey, right? One of the most financially devastating natural disasters in recent history. It's like having Hurricane Harvey hit Texas every 9 months. So, the fact that this book is forcing people to ask these really hard questions and giving them answers that they can seek and research themselves, I think the book has done its job.
Exactly. And I'm sure it's something that these people are realizing. Maybe they're not putting a exact word to it as Texas or the Texas Nationalist Movement, but they're feeling these negative effects of being governed by some bureaucrats, in Washington, D.C., not even in their own radius. And you could draw the parallels.
We got to use the word govern as loosely as possible because, right. These guys are pretty inept, right?
They certainly are.
Own executive branch, most of those bureaucrats are against him and his agenda, and he has to fight within his own government to get his agenda passed. I mean, now you're just talking about within the federal system itself. You're talking about people in states like Texas and the South throughout the country. I mean, they really have no say in what goes on in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, look, we get treated to this kabuki theater every 2 years like we have a say. But, one of the things that I tell people here in Texas is I say, look, do the math. I mean, you think we have a lot of representation. Do the math. We have 36 in the House of Representatives, 2 senators. That's 38 people. Okay. 38 out of 535. The math is not in our favor. When Texas has one of the largest economies, not in just the United States, but in the world, we're in the top 10 consistently. The fact that we're the number one job creator time and time and time again. The other states continue to look at us like a cash cow. We're one of about 10 states that is actually a net contributor into the union. So where does the rest of that money go? Well, it goes to these other states that have these failed progressive policies. Dare I bring up the Baltimore controversy, right? I mean, that's where our money goes. Yeah. I cite some pretty heinous examples in the book of where our money is frivolously spent on the federal level. But, I think at a very fundamental level, Texans understand that. But then they look at a situation like this crisis that we have on the southern border. They look at the fact that on average, the cost to the Texas taxpayer is about $9 billion to $12 billion a year for the broken border and a broken immigration system. And they then we have to get together every 2 years for the Texas legislative session and figure out how we're going to fund our schools, how we're going to have good roads, how we're going to take care of our people here. And they keep asking themselves, why are we paying into that system when we can't even take care of what we've got here?
Exactly. And how much longer could that sustain? I'm sure there's going to be a tipping point in the future, probably nearer than what we all suspect, as certainly something that happened in 2016. Now, how can our listeners learn more about the Texas Nationalist Movement and all that you do?
Sure, you can go check out our website at vtnm.org, and you'll find out everything about the organization. Of course, the book Texit, Why and How Texas Will Leave the Union is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere you can get books, it's available. So make sure you get a copy. Look, and let me just say this, for those people that are adamantly opposed, that just, those people I mentioned before that are at a visceral level say, are repulsed by the idea. If you want to be opposed to it for the right reasons. And I would suggest reading the book and then picking it apart and then asking yourself this question. If Texas or any other state were asked, right, and we're an independent nation right now, and we're asked to join the union, would you do it? Would you vote for it? So read the book, get informed. Let's elevate the conversation on both sides.
And I think all Americans, not just those living in Texas, could benefit from reading your book. Mr. Miller, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We wish you the best of luck in your continued efforts and work and hope to have you on again in the future. Take care and God bless.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate y'all so much.
Thank you very much.
We thank you for joining us today on another special Right On Point interview.
We value your positive and constructive feedback, so please send us an email at rop@rightonpointpodcast.com to voice your concerns and ideas about this show. You can also submit your comments on the contact page of our website, RightOnPointPodcast.com.
In addition, make sure you subscribe to our show on your platform of choice. We are available on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and many other outlets.
Find us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at ROP Podcast, like us on Facebook at ROP Podcast, and follow us on Instagram at RightOnPoint Podcast to participate in exclusive polls and view other great content.
When truth-telling has become a revolutionary act, we thank you again for tuning in to the podcast that is committed to delivering it right to you.
Until next time, I'm Olivia Ingrassia.
And I'm Paul Ingrassia. So long and God bless.